Yeah, that's fine.
There will be 3 presentations. Second.
Do you want to start? Do you want to start?
And the
Okay. We're ready to go. Hi, Christ is risen. Good evening. So thank you for coming out tonight. There will be 3 presentations total. Tonight I'm doing part 1, St. Cyril and Methodius, from St. Cyril and Methodius up to 1945. So it is a fast run through 1,100 years of history. And then part 2 is 1945 to 2023. And that's at the end of the month on April 30th. And then the third talk is actually the history of this parish, how this parish got started and grew to the level it's at now. And that will be in May. So in all of these which is exactly what I was just going to say, that this is all as part of our 50th anniversary celebration. So which is why we're doing this. And this, of course, is coming out of my book, my big, massive book, Looking to Tomorrow, The History and Mission of the Byzantine Catholic Church. So, with no further ado, we're going to start. All right. So, the Cyrilo-Methodian mission is in the 860s. Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius go to Central Europe, and that's the origins of the Byzantine Catholic Church. The Byzantine Ruthenian Catholic Church has its roots in Central Europe. The Prince of Great Moravia, Rostislav, wrote to the Eastern Roman Emperor, what we call the Byzantine Empire today, and asked for missionaries. Why? He had missionaries already from the Holy Roman Empire who were German, who were using the Latin Rite. And so his people, he writes in his letter, knew Christian law, but he needed the faith to be rooted in his country. It wasn't sinking in deeply enough. He also wanted political independence away from the Holy Roman Empire. Cyril and Methodius came from Thessalonica in northern Greece, and at this time, this was the second biggest city in the Eastern Roman Empire. It was one of the biggest cities in Europe. And they both knew what we call Old Slavonic. Old Slavonic is the language that is still used as a liturgical language in Eastern Europe by Greek Catholics and by Eastern Orthodox, both. And it was a language that all of the Slavic people at that time could understand. And that was critical, because they are going to go up there in order to proclaim the gospel, now not using Latin, but using Slavonic. They had gone on a mission to Khazaria, which was a state where the nobility was of the Jewish faith, and they didn't have success there, but they did retrieve the relics of St. Clement, the Pope of Rome, who had been exiled to Crimea by the emperors in the 2nd century. And they brought these relics with them when they go to Moravia, which it turns out to be very important. So they have a group of disciples, what are known as the 7 disciples, who go with them in order to bring the gospel and the Catholic faith to Central Europe. Around 862 is when they head out. And they were using the liturgy of St. Peter, which was a Byzantine variant, kind of a little bit of influence from the Roman Rite as well as a Byzantine Rite. They become, because of their great success, they are not only the patron saints of our church, which is why our seminary in Pittsburgh is named for them, but they become the patron saints of Bulgaria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. So they're very popular in Eastern Europe because they are the first ones who really undertake energetic missionary work, proclaiming the gospel to the people in a language and way that they could understand. And their 7 disciples, who in turn train disciples, head out across Eastern Europe, as we'll see, proclaiming the faith using either Rite, Latin or Byzantine, and using the Slavonic language. And the language is accepted as a liturgical language in the church by Popes Nicholas I and Adrian II in the 860s, and by John VIII in 879. They have to make 2 efforts to get Slavonic approved as a liturgical language. All right, this is Europe in the 800s. So over here was what is now the Khazar Empire in the 9th century. All right, the Magyars, the Hungarians, hadn't moved over into Central Europe yet. The Khazars and the Pechenegs are down here. The Volga Bulgars are here. And here are the other Bulgars. All right, the South Slavs are down here. Croats are here, and the Avars. The Carpathian Mountains are right here. The Avars and the white Croats are the ancestors of the Rusin people. And then next to them were the Slovaks. And the other Eastern Slavs here are what became the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, and then much later the Russians. All right, when the Norse would come down following the rivers and settle around Kiev, all right, for the nation of Kiev Rus, which is the ancestor of modern Ukraine. So here in the purple is what was the Eastern Roman Empire. Here's Constantinople. And all these different Slav nations had started migrating into the old Roman Empire, right, and settled in as colonists. These are the people that are looking for the gospel. Here are the West Poles, the Slovaks, and then the Poles, so the West Slavs and the Sorbs in what is now Germany. So it's a much different map than what we know, all right? But this was their world. So it was a big deal that they are abandoning the second biggest city of the empire, and therefore the second biggest city in Europe. And they are heading off into what was basically the wilderness in order to bring the gospel. And in order to do this out of love for Christ. Now, these are the presumed journeys. Here's Constantinople. Here's Thessalonica, where they came from. Either they traveled by sea to Venice and then went up to Velehrad, which was then the capital of Moravia, or they went by land through what is now Serbia and what is now Hungary and up into Velehrad. It's not really clear. But either way, this is what they do. So when later they have to come down to Rome, you see what an enormous journey it is for these guys. And they weren't young men. Right? They were already middle-aged by our standards, but by the standards of the day, they were getting on in years, and they take all these sacrifices out of love for Christ. So Great Moravia was this deep red. Only lasted for a short time. But Prince Rostislav, his intervention for his people in bringing Cyril and Methodius up to Europe, up into Central Europe, is so critical for the future of Christianity. So it's very much divine providence hard at work, all right, when they come in this, the perfect time frame. Great Moravia is strong enough to keep its independence. The German missionaries are already here, which is very important for our story. And the popes are down here in Rome. The Bulgar Empire is starting to grow and moving upward. And Constantinople, is the biggest city in the world and the flourishing capital of the Byzantine Empire. All right. So this picture shows, the missionaries working in both rites, right? Byzantine or Latin. So the Latins eventually go into Poland and much of Slovakia and what is now Czech Republic, Bohemia, Moravia. All right, the Byzantines go everywhere else. into what is now Bulgaria, Serbia, and Ukraine and Belarus. And then from there eventually into what becomes Russia later. All right. What happens to them? This is a famous Slovak painting. We present to you the Bible in your own language. All right. Here are the two brothers proclaiming the gospel to the people. All right. They get in trouble with the German missionaries. Why? First, there was animosity between Byzantine and Latin. That was just part of history. Second thing is, they celebrated the liturgy, the sacraments, and proclaimed the gospel and did all their preaching in Slavonic. The German missionaries came up with this crazy theory that has no basis whatsoever in history, that the only languages acceptable for use in church are Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, because those are the languages on the cross. Right? The sign above Jesus' head, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, was written in those three languages. Utter nonsense, because missionaries had been using all kinds of languages from the shores of Britain all the way to southern India for 800 years. There were lots of languages that were used for preaching, and there were multiple languages that were used in worship, not just Latin and Greek and Hebrew. So Syriac was widespread, Armenian was widespread, Malayalam was used in India. So, this has no basis in reality at all. It comes out of the conflict that was developing between the churches of Rome and Constantinople, and a lot of cultural superiority on both sides. Okay, so the brothers' disciples go from Velehrad into this territory, which becomes the main homeland of our church, of our particular church. Before I do that, they have to go to Rome twice. Cyril and Methodius both go to Rome, and they take with them the relics of St. Clement. They bring the relics of St. Clement, Pope of Rome, to Rome. The Pope receives them and is delighted, of course. And they explain to him what they're doing. They have all of this false information that they have to deal with, what we would call fake news today. And they get all that clarified to the Pope. Excuse me. And then the Holy Father issues a bulla after they celebrate the liturgy in Slavonic in St. Peter's Church in Rome. So it's canonized in a sense. All right. St. Cyril dies there, is buried in the Church of St. Clement, appropriately. His brother goes back. His brother has more trouble with the missionaries. Once more he has to come back, present his case to yet another pope, and that pope issues a letter also claiming that Slavonic can be used, and that the alphabet that Cyril invented, the Glagolitic alphabet, could be used. In the Latin Rite, this survives only in Croatia. But in the Byzantine Rite, this spreads all over Eastern Europe and Southern Europe in the Balkans. So it's very important what they did. And they're expelled when Moravia collapses. But the disciples go south into what was the Bulgarian Empire, and they go east, and they go north. All right, this is the territory of our mother church in Europe. So northeastern Hungary, eastern Slovakia, southeastern Poland, and what is now southwestern Ukraine, and northern Transylvania, which is now in Romania. This borderline here is basically the Carpathian Mountains. So this is a map. The purple areas are the Rusin population, where they settled in the Lemko region, these parts of the Prešov region, and Subcarpathian Rus, and in part of Transylvania. But the other populations were Slovak and Hungarian and Romanian. And all of them follow what was known as the Greek Rite. And that's important. All right, they didn't call it Byzantine Rite. Byzantine is a 19th century invention by archaeologists who no longer wanted to say Constantinopolitan all the time. You try and say Constantinopolitan in sentence after sentence. It's very hard, and it's very awkward. So they came up with Byzantine because Constantinople originally was Byzantium. It was a small port called Byzantium. That's where we get the name Byzantine from. But in Eastern Europe, what we call the Byzantine Rite today was the Rite of Constantinople, because the brothers were Greek and the original language was Greek, and it was the dominant rite in the Eastern Roman Empire. People called it the Greek Rite. And that comes into play later on, the use of the names. So the mountains form a real barrier between the Ukrainian plains and the rest of Europe. And the people living here eventually come under the rule of the Hungarian nobility, who ruled all through the Prešov region and Subcarpathian Rus. This was just known as Northern Hungary for 1,000 years, right? But they were not Hungarian, but they're known as, they are subjects of Hungary, but they're not ethnically Hungarian, all right? When the Hungarians settled in this region, a large number of them followed the Greek Rite, and there were monasteries and parishes down here. But they eventually disappeared, right? And the Latin Rite became dominant among the ethnic Hungarians. In this region, parts of this territory in Spiš have never been out of communion with the Holy See, ever. All right? The Greek Rite parishes in this part of Slovakia. They always had some kind of union with Rome, and they had bishops that lived in this region as well. So a lot of the Slovaks followed the Byzantine Rite, and a majority of them followed the Latin Rite. German colonists were brought in by these various noble families because of the trades that they followed, and a number of these German villages switched over to the Byzantine Rite. So and then you have the Lemkos up in here. So it's a very multi-ethnic church, which is forgotten way too often. It did not come to America as a church of Rusins. It came to America as a church of Rusins, of Slovaks, of Hungarians, of Germans, of Jews, of Ukrainians, Bulgarians, Romanians, Croats. There were lots of people in our church. So it was a very diverse church from the get-go. All right. Here's Mukachevo. The bishop lived in Mukachevo. All right, and he lived here in the monastery of St. Nicholas, all right, right above the river. The monastery was inhabited by monks who followed the rule of St. Basil. The monks and the parish priests elected the bishop. Whenever a bishop would die, they were in office till death, not until the age of 75 like today. And they were there as double rulers. They were rulers of the church, and they were within Hungary. This was the border of the Hungarian kingdom. This was the border of Poland, Lithuania. All right, so the Lemko people gradually come under the bishop here in Przemyśl. All right, they're not under the bishop in Mukachevo. The bishop had a double role. He was the bishop of the church, and he was also the ethnarch. He was really the leader of the people. And there are different times in history where the Hungarian kings called on the bishop of Mukachevo to intervene on behalf of the government with the people. Okay, so St. Nicholas Monastery. St. Nicholas is very important in our church. St. Nicholas is in all churches of the Byzantine Rite. St. Nicholas is always at the north end of the iconostas. He's the saint of justice and for the poor, the saint of children. You know, he's very important. But in our church, he takes on an extra importance because of this, because of the bishop living in a monastery dedicated to St. Nicholas. And in the 19th century, there's a famous apparition of St. Nicholas in Lutina, where he comes to give a message to the people. So Nicholas has a very important role. The bishop had to live in the monastery in order to rule the church and to rule the people. All right. So this is one of the oldest churches, the Church of St. Anne, known as the Horiani Rotunda, from the 11th century. It's a stone church up in the hills, and there's certain old, really ancient churches like this from the 11th century. So we're talking around the year 1000, where they are famous for having these curved apse where the altar is. All right, and you find a few of them have survived in the Hungarian plain. This is the only one. This is the only stone one up in the Carpathian Mountains like this. So the Horiani Rotunda is very famous. Now this is the inside. The Horiani Rotunda church was on the property of the Drugeth family. The Drugeths originally came from Italy, from Naples. They were nobles, Italian nobility, who came all the way up into the Carpathians, invited by the Hungarian crown. It shows you that this is not a church that lived in isolation from the rest of the world. This is very much a church that is at the crossroads of Europe. Now, the Carpathian Mountains are pierced by several passes. You had to go through Subcarpathian Rus in order to get into Ukraine, in order to reach beyond Ukraine, and vice versa. So, and Hungary was interconnected with Western Europe, just as ancient Kiev Rus was interconnected with much of Western Europe. This has all been lost to a lot of modern people under propaganda of the past century, especially by the Soviets. So these frescoes in the Horiani Rotunda were done in the 14th century by Italian artists of the Renaissance who come all the way up there. Blessed Theodore Ramsha was partly descended from Italian settlers. There's, again, a very rich history behind our church. Now, this is St. Michael Church, built in what is known as the Lemko style. A low dome here, a higher over the altar, a high dome over the nave, and then the big tower, which is where the front door is. And here are the people. Men on one side, women on the other side. And that's how people sat in church. Right? Men were always on the right, women on the left. Boys became men the day they left their mother and could sit with their father, right? Who would be on the right-hand side or up in the choir loft. So these wooden churches were built without any nails, not because they didn't have nails. They had nails. They used nails all the time. They had ironworks. They are built like this, with dovetailing, all of the wood always together like this, because you do not put a nail into the body of Christ. It's a theological point, right? That Christ's body, they understood clearly that the church is the body of Christ holding the people of God. Right? So this is a very popular style of wooden churches. We have a few of these in America now. This is a Boyko style. So not such a low dome over the altar, right? And with these ridges, right? And again, all solid wood, right? All dovetailed together. And the shingles, all wood. Everything was wooden. A lot of these churches have not survived because they're wooden. One thing I had to get used to when I first went over there was electric sanctuary lamps. All right, even in stone churches, they have electric sanctuary lamps. Why? Because the glass would shatter sometimes in these ancient churches, and there would be a fire, and the church would be burned. And once electricity came, they weren't going through that again. All right, and these parishes go back for centuries. When I celebrated liturgy at one church, they took me to the new church, which was built in 1832. My great-great-great-grandfather was still living in Europe in 1832. This was the new church. And I said, so where's the old church? I said, well, we'll take you to the old altar, which was in a chapel. It was a stone altar, and they said, so this is the old altar, which was from the 1500s. And he said, of course, this is from the other church. We have, this is where the other church was, the original church. So how many churches have you had here? Well, they weren't really sure because they knew the wooden church had burned at least twice. But you're standing, at a place where people have prayed for centuries, where this village went back at least to the 1300s. And they were doing all of this kind of work. It was fantastic. It was so cool. All right, this is a Hutzel-style church up in the mountains, Yesinia. And this is a 4 wings coming together with a central dome. Not many windows. There's not many windows in the churches. All right, see how small they are? But it's quite powerful when you're in a church and the electric lights weren't on and the sun is coming through the dome and through these little windows like this, and you're at the altar, and the people are singing, and they're singing everything, and you can feel the vibrations in the wooden floor of their voices, and everybody knows everything. Wow. It's just so powerful, that, the importance of congregational singing. This is the Gothic style, possibly influenced by churches built by German colonists, possibly not. Nobody's really sure. But it's called Gothic style because of these high towers. You find these, especially in Transylvania, in Romania, these enormous, enormous towers, going way, way up. So it's just really magnificent churches. And a lot of fine woodwork carving. All right. Okay, this is a very typical Carpathian farmhouse, which you still find in villages. And I was in one really old one, which the family was still living in, and they showed me how one side had been the barn, and then the center was where the family did all its living, and where the icons were, and where they just did all of their stuff, and the kitchen was there, and then the other end was the bedroom for their parents, and then the children as they came along. So that was a very traditional tripart setup of a house with a deep, steep roof of thatch, right? Storage up here, and it's also steep because of the snows, right? The heavy snows, so that the snow would fall off easily down into the yard, right? And wouldn't be too much weight on the ridgepole. So very creative, very smart building. Front porch here, where people could sit. Villages were, compact, and you could just see how this got carried over into Pennsylvania, where people built their first houses and had their front porch and would sit and go up and down the hill, visiting with one another, sitting on the porch. All right, this is our cathedral in Užhorod. It was originally a Jesuit church, not with an iconostas. The Jesuits had built this Baroque church. And then Empress Maria Theresa gave this church to our eparchy of Mukachevo in the late 1700s. The Jesuits had been expelled and were no longer working there. And so the church was given to us, and then they brought in, wood carvers and icon painters to create this magnificent traditional iconostas, which goes all the way up to the ceiling. With the royal doors down here, and the 12 holy days, and the apostles, and the patriarchs, and the crucifixion with the Blessed Mother and St. John underneath, and the Last Supper, and Christ the King. So, a really classic Byzantine Rite church. If Father Artur had stayed in Europe, he would have been ordained here, right? This would have been your cathedral. Would they ever? Oh, they would have ordained you in the parish? Yeah. But when he became a bishop, see, you would have been taking over from here. Yeah, this would be your cathedral then, because there would be your chair. Right? There's the throne for the bishop. But it was above it. It really impressed me when I saw it the first time. There's a big icon of Jesus as the high priest above the bishop's throne. You're the vicar of Christ. for the local church. It certainly would keep you humble, I would think, that you're sitting underneath Jesus all the time. This is the cathedral in Prešov, St. John the Baptist in Prešov, in Slovakia, again with a full iconostas. And, whoops, that wasn't a fun moment. This was used by the Orthodox. Both churches were used by the Orthodox during communism, but then we got them back after communism. This is a typical Hungarian church in Tokaj, the famous wine-growing region. This is in northern Hungary. This is from the 18th century. And again, they have all the things that you need to have a church of the Byzantine Rite. In a very small village, in a very modest place, the people there was no limit, to decorating for the glory of God. And this is the cathedral in Croatia, in Križevci. It's very unusual because it's a Gothic-style church. It was redone in the Gothic style in the 19th century, and that's why you have all these Gothic arches. So the iconostas kind of gets squeezed in here. And this is the church in what is now Serbia, in Ruski Krstur, St. Nicholas Cathedral. This was a village church. The Križevci was also a village church. So, the people, these ordinary farmers and herdsmen and craftsmen, they wanted their church to be gorgeous, and to have everything that was needed for the full celebration of the liturgy of the Byzantine Rite and all of its glory. And that says a lot for them. All right, 1054 is the famous date, which is completely wrong, of the schism between East and West, that the Latin church, which is the orange, and the Eastern church, which is the blue, the Greek church, split. They really didn't split in 1054. It was a complicated fight between a cardinal sent by the Pope and the patriarch. And the emperor himself was appalled when it happened, when they excommunicated one another. And the emperor intervened afterwards, and communion was restored. But it marks the real beginning, all right, for the next less than 200 years. By 1204, things are really hot. And you have the final tearing apart. Why? Because the Pope had called for the Fourth Crusade, which was to go to help the emperor drive back the Turks. Instead, the Crusaders got involved with Venice, which was providing the ships for them to travel. They attacked Catholic cities that were enemies of Venice, and then they got involved in politics in the Eastern Roman Empire and got involved in that. And afterwards, they attacked the city. Constantinople fell. They looted the city. This is when the shroud that is now called the Shroud of Turin disappears from Constantinople and suddenly shows up in northern Italy, belonging to the royal family of Savoy. The four horses from the Hippodrome racetrack end up on top of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. All kinds of relics of saints are taken. And when the Pope got a detailed report of the atrocities that the Crusaders had committed and the things that they had done, which were quite terrible, he said, there will never be communion reestablished with the Greeks after this. And he was right, because we are still separated. The Latin Church becomes known as the Catholic Church, and the Greek Church becomes known as Orthodox Church. Catholic means universal, Orthodox means of the true faith, and so this is how it all falls apart. And here is the Kingdom of Hungary and the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, and here's our church right on the border, where you have orange and blue mixed together. Once again, the problem when you're located in a strategic area, you will unfortunately become the center of attention. Okay, so the Eparchy Mukachevo is a dependent diocese of Constantinople. All right? The bishop was elected locally, as I said, by the monks and by the parish priests, right? But was confirmed by Constantinople. Necessarily, they follow Constantinople, and inside the Kingdom of Hungary, now you have a large Orthodox population that is no longer in local intercommunion with the Latin Church. Right? Once everything falls apart after the Fourth Crusade, as time goes on, there's more and more division, and it becomes very hardened. Right? In 1439, there was an attempt at the Council of Florence. There was an attempt to bring the churches back together. The Metropolitan of Kiev, Isidore, signed the Act of Union. He went back to Kiev and proclaimed that, and then he went north to Moscow, and the Grand Prince there had him arrested, right? Because he did not want anything to do with the Latin Church. And now, 1439, you have absolutely no communion inside the empire. Down here, ironically, there was still intercommunion between Latins and Greeks in the islands and on the mainland, and down in here, they did. They went to each other's churches, they got sacraments from one another. Greek priests even went to confession to Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s. But the further away you move from that area, the harder the lines become. So you have the Orthodox Eparchy in Mukachevo inside the Kingdom of Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary eventually, because of various circumstances, the royal family becomes the Habsburgs, who ruled Austria. And the Habsburg Archdukes of Austria, who became the kings of Hungary, were also the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire. All of this comes together. Very important. Why? Because in Catholic-ruled Poland, some of the Orthodox eparchies signed an act of union in 1596, guaranteeing full preservation of the Byzantine rite and that everything stays the same. The only difference would be that they would accept any future doctrines defined by the Holy See of Rome. The people in Hungary watched this. The Drugeth family had gotten involved in the Reformation and had become Protestant. Jesuits brought them back to the Catholic Church. The Drugeth nobles wanted their villagers, who they ruled over in Hungary, to become Catholic. And this seemed like the perfect solution. Right? And it became a real struggle then to achieve it. All right, why become Catholic? Land persecution. A lot of the landlords in Hungary not only persecuted and harassed the Orthodox, they would force them to work on Orthodox holy days. They would literally go into the church, even the cathedral in Mukachevo, and drag the priests away from the altars and make the priests work in the fields on holy days. They even dragged the bishop away from the altar. They were deprived of their civil rights because they were Orthodox. Greek Christians did not have the same rights as Latin Christians and Protestants. There was interference with the faith by the Protestant clergy and the Protestant rulers, especially the Rákóczi, right, whereby the Rákóczi tried to introduce a reformed Byzantine rite run by Protestant ministers who would teach Protestant doctrine. They stopped communion of children. They tried to stop veneration of icons. They were trying to bring in all the changes of the Reformation. So there were villages that were losing the faith. There was a great desire on the part of the priests that they wanted a better education for themselves and for their sons, because the priesthood at this time was heavily dependent on the married priesthood, that sons often followed their fathers into the priesthood. And they were seeing after the Reformation, when the Catholic Church had what we call the Counter-Reformation, there was this huge emphasis on education, theological education, but also secular education. So they wanted better theological education for themselves. They couldn't answer these reformed ministers. They couldn't stand up to the Rákóczi rulers' changes and innovations. And they wanted a better education for the children of the villages. They wanted a future that other people were getting. They could not respond with good apologetics to either side, to the Protestant Reformation And they couldn't explain well why we do what we do. Right? So they were always having to try and defend themselves against Latin missionaries. And they didn't know enough. There weren't many books. They had gotten a very basic education themselves. So there were a lot of abuses happening. There was divorce and remarriage without any church process. There was remarriage 3 or 4 times. There were priests who got divorced and remarried, which is absolutely forbidden by the canons in the Eastern churches. They didn't have publications of their own. It was impossible to get stuff out of Constantinople or the Ottoman Empire. They had very limited resources, and they had no seminary. Everything was done by a father or cantor teaching a boy who then would go off to get ordained. It wasn't enough. And in the monasteries as well. Same problem. Everybody was facing this. And the Jesuits came in, and they were forcing a lot of Orthodox into the Latin Church using pressure from landlords. And even after the union was signed, they would take Greek Catholics and tell them, you're not really Catholic, you have to be Roman Catholic, you got to be Latin Catholic. Then you'll be saved, because you could still go to hell now. So it wasn't a good setup for them. So the bishops and the priests, Bishop Parthenius, the priests wanted exemptions from labor. They had to work on the land of the landlords like ordinary peasants. They would be yoked to a plow just like everybody else. Right? And they had their own land that they had to work on in order to feed their families. They wanted an exemption from labor on the various estates. They wanted an end to their parishes being forced into the Latin Church. They wanted those exemptions not because they were lazy. They were not. They were hard workers. One priest could have 4 or 5 churches. There you had a main parish, and then you had filiali. You had filial churches that he would have to travel off to. They needed these exemptions to fulfill their obligations to the people. They needed legal security against the bailiffs of the landlords who would come in and haul the priests off to do manual labor, even on holy days. They wanted a status equal to the Latin priests, and they wanted that status to be legally protected, and they wanted protection against forcing the villages into the Latin rite. They wanted to get the point across that they were equal. The Latin and Greek rites are equal rites of one faith. The Basilians, the monks, were to be given assistance to open schools for children funded by the landlords, because the Latin schools, Latin villages had schools like that. There was an Orthodox hierarchy parallel to what became the Greek Catholics that was created by the Rakoczy. And they had to fight against that quasi-reformed church and Greek church. And they wanted to be able to build churches freely and without any interference, all right, under the bishop's control, not under the control of Lutheran or Calvinist ministers. All right, they wanted legal emancipation of the priests who united with the Holy See and their protection against the nobility, a permanent residence for the bishop, so until he could take his place at St. Nicholas. All right, and here is the union. So the first union in 1646, this is the actual document itself with the signatures. It's written in Latin because Latin was the national language. Why? Because it was neutral. It was dead. It didn't belong to any ethnic group. So in the Hungarian Kingdom and the Austrian Empire, Latin was used really up until 1848 in Parliament and so forth. So it's an official legal document, and then they signed their names in Slavonic underneath. Okay. So 63 priests of the Mukachevo eparchy, under the control of the Drugeth family from the Horiani Rotunda territory, they became Catholic priests of the Greek rite under the Diocese of Eger, under the authority of the Eger bishop. All right, that was the northern diocese in Hungary. It only affected parishes that were under Catholic landlords in Slovakia and around Užhorod, which then was called Ungvar. 6 years later, they have another union. Why? Because it's spreading. More priests want this, and the guys who had signed originally learned their lesson. You can't be a Byzantine priest under a Latin bishop. It doesn't work well. And so in 1652, they got a union that specified the preservation of the Greek rite, the election of the bishop by the priest confirmed by Rome, and full ecclesiastical protection by royal law, and the deacons, archdeacons for 6 deaneries signed with 400 priests signed. So this is the vast majority of the eparchy now. And then in 1720, the Union of Máramaros was signed. That extended the union eastward. So now the entire eparchy of Mukachevo is Catholic. All right, the Empress Maria Theresa, the first woman to rule the Austrian Empire, she calls the first synod of the Eastern Catholics in the empire. The word uniate is abandoned. The Orthodox still use it. It has a pejorative sense to it, a very negative sense that we're not neither fish nor fowl. We're not really Catholic, we're not really Eastern. She said, no, that no more of that. And she came up with this phrase, Greek Catholic. Catholics following the Greek rite. So they're Greek Catholics. So if you ever go into Eastern Europe, Grecko-Katolicki. Which are you? I was going to have liturgy in the Maria Poch Basilica, and the sacristan brought out hosts. And I said, well, what am I going to do with these? And he said, well, he spoke English, and he spoke German, and he said, oh, für Ihre Messe, for your Mass. And I said, aber ich bin gräkische Katholische. Ach, du Liebe, Sie sind gräkische. Oh, das ist so good. You're Greek. That's wonderful. And he went back over to the house, and he got the priest, and he kept on saying, he's Greek, he's Greek. They were, we thought you were Roman Catholic. Well, they were all very nice to me, but after that I was in. Now I was golden. So, but it's a very normal phrase in Eastern Europe, all right? But it caused problems coming to America. Okay, so Greek Catholic. So she authorized publication of liturgical books, catechisms, founding parishes, that there be a church within 1 hour's walk of every village. All right, to us that sounds terrible as lazy Americans, but to those people this was great because people were walking half a day. All right, regularized the status of the priests, the schools, the monasteries, defended their orthodoxy constantly. There were constant attacks on the Greek Catholics by certain Latin bishops saying they weren't really Catholic. And she really intervened on our behalf. She achieved the canonical establishment of the eparchy Mukachevo and the ancient eparchy of Krzewcy with recognition by the Holy See of Rome. How she did it? She wrote to Rome. Rome was dilly-dallying. They said, we want paperwork. And she tried to explain, there is no paperwork. This is from the 9th century probably. There's no papers. And no, we're going to establish a new diocese. And she wrote back, you know what? I'm the Apostolic Queen of Hungary, and in our Constitution, I have the right to establish dioceses. I'm going to do it on my own. And in Rome, they said, we can't have a woman establish a diocese. So they gave the recognition. And that really is, I'm not making it up, that really is how it went. So, and established a permanent connection between the imperial family and our church. To this day, they have a panihida every year for Maria Theresa at the cathedral. What time is it? 10:07. Yoy. All right, this is the famous weeping icon of Maria Poch. All right, that's the original, which is in Vienna.
No, the original is...
No, what? Okay. The original is in Vienna. I had liturgy at this altar. And then this is the copy that was made in Hungary after the original was taken to Vienna at the request of the imperial family. This has not wept, but there's been lots of cures. This has wept twice more. Okay, the Baronjevo icon, which is the patron of the Mission Society, This icon of Our Lady in the village of Klokočovo in Slovakia has wept when it was stabbed by a Calvinist soldier when they were raiding the village trying to force the people into Protestantism. And the Mother of God began to weep when the soldier bayoneted her, and he bayoneted her again, and she wept more, and then the soldiers fled. This is the expansion of the church. Okay, so the Eparchy Mukachevo up in here, the Eparchy Križevci down here, the Eparchy Prešov for here, for Slovakia, Hajdúdorog for Hungary. All right? And again, a multi-ethnic church with all these different nationalities in it. Emigration to America. Why did people emigrate? Rapid population expansion in Austria-Hungary as healthcare improved in the 19th century. Liberalization of immigration rules out of the empire in the 1850s. Repeated famines and a decline in the amount of farmland. The exploitation by noble families. U.S. companies sent agents into Austria-Hungary to recruit workers. There were miners who were very good in the Carpathian Mountains and the Tatras, and they were brought over to work in American mines. High wages in America helped men to return and buy better farms or open a business. Big attraction, free public education for children in America, that kids had a future. And then the coming of priests who opened Greek Catholic parishes in the U.S. The Slavs concentrated most in Canada. Why? Down here, all right, in the Midwest, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York City, that's the main areas in the United States. They really concentrate here, especially Ukrainians, because in 1924, America passed restrictive immigration laws, but Canada desperately wanted immigrants. And so they are concentrated out here in the prairie provinces because it's the land is the same quality and the same climate zone as in Ukraine. So they were able to grow wheat. And the same thing happened with people coming from Russia, from the Volga Valley. A lot of Germans settled up here from the Volga. So our church really gets rooted here in these dark areas, okay? As we'll see, this is the first Greek Catholic church in the United States, St. Michael's Church in Shenandoah. It was founded by Ukrainian and Ruthenian immigrants. So it was a mixed parish. St. Mary of the Dormition is the oldest Ruthenian parish in the United States. That's the first church, then the second church, and then this is the church that's there today. Bishop Soter Ortinsky was the first bishop. He was a Ukrainian Basilian monk who was brought to America in 1907 by the Pope. He was very limited in what he could do. All of the Greek Catholic parishes were under the authority of the local Latin bishop. He had to go to each bishop and get permission to go into his own church, to make a visitation, to look at the records, to look at the bank account, anything. So it was very bad, and it had very powerful impact on the people that the bishop was treated so poorly by Rome and by way too many Latin bishops in America. And it led to anger in the Russian Empire, where the Tsar felt that this was now his opportunity to push orthodoxy among the people, and it led to anger in the parishes in the United States. So it was a tough situation for him. Alexis Toth was one of our priests. This is the Archbishop of Minneapolis, John Ireland. He's known as the father of Orthodoxy in the United States by the Orthodox Church, because the Russian Orthodox Church was very small, concentrated originally in Alaska and California. Orthodox immigration coming to America. Bishop moved into the lower 48, and the government of Russia was sending money to do missionary work among the Greek Catholics to make them, convert them to Orthodoxy. He, as a widower, went to Minneapolis, to the existing parish. He had to get his faculties from Archbishop Ireland. Archbishop Ireland said, "I don't want a priest like you," because he had been married, even though his wife was dead. And he felt that Toth's priesthood was tainted by his marriage. And he refused to give him permission, and he sent the police to close the church on Christmas Day. And the whole parish 95% of the parish went into the Russian Orthodox Church. And Toth devoted the rest of his life to going around America to convince Greek Catholics to join the Russian Orthodox Church. So I call Ireland Father of Orthodoxy. Without him and his behavior, things would have been different. But he was very typical of a lot of Latin bishops. They did not want married priests at all. They demanded that Rome send them back. Or, my favorite, send the wizened kids back and leave the priest in America. It was total disrespect for the sacrament of matrimony. So here you see, by 1911, this is where the church was concentrated. Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Connecticut, Illinois, around Chicago, Massachusetts, Missouri, Indiana, near Chicago. Minneapolis, the community was rebuilt by new immigrants and a small core group that had remained Catholic. Denver, Wyoming. Okay, I'm going to speed up. Dividing the church, Galicians versus Hungarian. This became the big fight. Who are we? The Ukrainians were emphasizing their national identity against the Poles and against the Russians. The Hungarians, in quotes, weren't really sure who the heck they were. You had ethnic Hungarians, you had ethnic Romanians, you had ethnic Croats, and you had Rusins and Slovaks who called themselves Slavish, Carpatho-Russian, Carpatho-Rusin. Their national identity of the Rusins was coming along very slowly, and the Slovaks were, if I'm Slovak, can I be Greek Catholic still? So in 1924, in 1916, after Ortinsky died, Rome decided to split the diocese into two jurisdictions. One for Ukrainians, one for Hungarians. Anybody who came from the old Kingdom of Hungary, except for the Romanians. They didn't want to be part of this, so they stayed under the Latin bishops. And how bad did the fighting get? This is an honest-to-God real headline from New Britain, Connecticut, from a church fight in 1908. This fight was because the Galician cantor, the cantor was supposed to be the Galician cantor that Sunday, but he was sick, so the Ruthenian cantor started the liturgy singing according to a Rusin melody, and the Galicians started to fight. And so then a Galician went up and took over, and then the Ruthenians started to fight, and this was the headline on Monday morning. Factions fight, rival church clans batter in each other's heads, altar desecrated in mad fury of Galicians and Hungarians, climaxed a long smoldering trouble in Greek Catholic Church. They were rather intense about their feelings. And the nuncio actually told, when the two bishops were appointed, he said, I have had more trouble with your people than I have had from all of the Latin dioceses in America combined, because there was so much fighting in parishes. It's very sad. It's a terrible waste of energy, and parishes split, and you go to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, you'll have a Ukrainian church on one corner, Ukrainian Greek Catholic here, Ukrainian Orthodox here, Byzantine Catholic here, Carpatho-Russian Orthodox here, all within 4 blocks of each other. And it's a real shame. 100 years ago, we finally got our own Ruthenian bishop, first Byzantine Catholic bishop in the United States, Basil Takacs from Czechoslovakia. He had a tough time because there's tension between American clergy and foreign clergy, between adapting to the U.S. and going home someday. People thought they would go home, a lot of the priests and their families, but they really didn't. He had to establish an organized diocese and bring all the parishes together, register the parishes. It was a lot of work that this guy had to deal with. This is our former cathedral in Munhall, Pennsylvania, which is now a cultural center. Sisters of St. Basil came in 1921. Mother Macrina, the first Mother Superior, and these are all American-born girls who joined the order, the very first ones. They had an orphanage, St. Nicholas in Elmhurst, and then they opened schools. This is the oldest Greek Catholic school in the United States, in Freeland. Big schism, and then I'm going to wrap it up here. Big schism took place in 1929. The Vatican sent this letter, Cum data fuerit, mandated only celibate men could be ordained to the holy priesthood in America. Only celibate men could immigrate as priests or seminarians to America. The people saw it as a final step to complete Latinization. It was also, though, there was a prohibition on clergy owning church property. There was provision made for greater authority on the part of the bishop and to bring the diocese together. Rome really thought this was going to be a great document that was going to bring everything together and the bishop would have a strong, healthy diocese. But so many people reacted so negatively, and so many priests did, and there were priests who really didn't want the bishop to have a lot of authority, to be honest, that it's called the celibacy schism still today, but there was a lot more happening. But it was a terrible rupture, and it created, for the first time since 1720, a Ruthenian Orthodox Church, which still exists in America today, with this enormously long name. And 180,000 people left our church. It was a terrible, terrible loss. And churches were split, in which new churches had to be founded. Families were divided. I knew people who, the parents and children, adult children, they never spoke again over this. It was very sad. This was the big pilgrimage, and this is why Our Lady of Perpetual Help becomes so popular. Pope Pius XI felt very bad about what happened, and he sent the icon of Our Mother Perpetual Help. He sent it to the sisters at Uniontown, and they started a pilgrimage, an outpost, on Labor Day weekend. It was for the reunion of the two churches together and unity in the parishes. And it was a huge success, although the Orthodox Church still exists, as I said. So we have the famous Fulton Sheen, had Byzantine faculties. He came to Uniontown a number of times and celebrated liturgy in the Byzantine rite. And this is how big the outpost could get, 50,000 or more people. It was huge. Gigantic, from all over America. All right, this is where I'm going to end. It's not where I was going to end, but I'm out of time. So this is what happens in Europe. 1918, World War I ended, and much to the dismay of the Vatican, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was torn apart into these countries, into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Austria. The German Trentino went to Italy, and then the Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and the Bosniaks were all put into one country where they did not like one another, Yugoslavia. And Romania was expanded by annexing Transylvania. It split up the eparchy of Mukachevo into three countries. Prešov was in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was run by a very liberal government that didn't like Catholics, either Latin or Byzantine, which created major problems down the road, which we will see on April 30th, because it's now after 7 o'clock, I think. Yes? 7:05. 7:05. You wanted me to go an hour. What do you want me to do? Finish? Yeah? Go to 1945? You all right? Yes? Doing okay? Are you lost? Who said yes? Oh, you got to read the whole book, yeah. You got to buy the book. Then you can read the book. See, people that are watching, you got to buy the book. Well, you got to buy the Bible, too, but the Byzantine Bible, my book. All right, so real fast. Here's Mukachevo. Here's Mukachevo. Here's Uzhhorod. All right, Empress Maria Theresa had moved the bishop from Mukachevo to Uzhhorod. All right, Uzhhorod is on the Uzh River. This becomes an artificial boundary. The province of Subcarpathian Rus is on its own. Then you have Slovakia, and then Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia. All right, this is Czechoslovakia. Hungary became a kingdom without a king. The Greek Catholics were still concentrated in the north. Now they had two jurisdictions, Miskolc and Hajdúdorog, south of Nyíra Jiháza. All right. And then further, so what happens is that in Czechoslovakia, Russian Orthodox propaganda had been very successful among immigrants in America who went home. All right? They went back to Europe. And they brought back, they bought new farms, opened new stores. Okay, they're successful. They come back, and they come back with the idea that we are Russian. All right? So they come back as now that they're Russian and that they're Orthodox. In World War I, this caused major problems because Russia invaded Austria-Hungary and persecuted the Greek Catholics, especially in Ukraine, which they occupied for a couple years. Then, after the revolution in the Soviet Union, a lot of anti-communist refugees called White Russians fled into Czechoslovakia, building Orthodox churches and Orthodox monasteries. And they worked together with these converts who had come from America. They tried to convince Greek Catholics to become Orthodox. And the government supported them because the government was anti-Catholic. Why? The government saw the Catholic Church as being connected to the old imperial family and the old nobility. So it was a lot of political. It was very violent. Catholics were violently persecuted in these territories. Down here, it was really bad in Mukachevo. All right? In Prešov, it was not as successful. The Orthodox movement was much smaller. Here, it got pretty big. And there was a lot of state support from the government in Prague. And as a result, this is the reason that when the rest of the Byzantine Ruthenian Catholic Church went on the new calendar in 1915 in the Kingdom of Hungary, down here, Hajdúdorog and Prešov did, but the bishop in Mukachevo said, there's no way. Because if I go on the new calendar, the people in Subcarpathia, they'll go ballistic, and they're just going to say that it's a Latinization, and they'll go to the Orthodox. So they've only gone now, because of the war with Russia, now that the eparchy here is completely new calendar. All right, so they built churches that were very Russian-looking, all right, and Russian culture and Russian chant and so forth. And the same thing happened in America. A lot of parishes that were originally the big church in Buffalo, where I'm from, in my old neighborhood, Saints Peter and Paul, says on the cornerstone, Russian, Greek Catholic, Orthodox Church, but it's a very Russian parish. Okay, here's Yugoslavia. So Križevci is outside of Zagreb, right? It's over this way, right? Here's Novi Sad. Ruski Krstur is in here. So the church here is interesting because it's a mix of Russian immigrants and Slovak immigrants who were Greek Catholic, who came down in the 1700s and merged into this little Serbian Greek Catholic diocese of Križevci that was founded in 1611. And then you have Romanian Greek Catholics who move over. And then in the 1800s, you have Ukrainian Greek Catholics who come and settle in Bosnia mostly. So Križevci was serving Bulgarian Greek Catholics, Romanian Greek Catholics, Russian Greek Catholics, Hungarian Greek Catholics, Croatian and Serbians, and the Ukrainians down in here, as well as this whole movement that took place from the Union of Kukush of Macedonians. That poor bishop had to speak like 6 languages, and everything had to be issued in all these languages. It was amazing for one little diocese. All right, what happens is that the war comes. The Vatican had warned that at Versailles, the Vatican was banned from attending the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And the Pope's representative warned the French, the Americans, and the British. He said, if you create a chain of small countries, they will not be able to withstand the pressures of Russia. Which is exactly what happened. And if they are not united, as they were in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, into some sort of federation, they will not survive. All right. In 1933, Hitler takes over in Germany, all right, and starts National Socialism, which was very racist. You got to remember for what is coming, not just against the Jews, but also against the Slavs, right? He was going to keep Poles and Ukrainians as servant class, really. These countries were aligned to Germany during World War II. An independent state was created in Croatia. Hungary, a new country of Slovakia, was created when Czechoslovakia was destroyed in 1938, and Romania. Okay, the rest of it doesn't really matter for our purposes. The Slovak government was a fascist government, right? The Hlinka Guard and so forth, under Father Tiso was the president. They were very anti-Ruthenian, and they were anti-Greek Catholic. And the bishop, Blessed Paul Peter Gojdich, had a really hard time in the Slovak state. He was really harassed and mistreated, and he was a very gentle man. He had a tough time. In Hungary, expanded, and in Hungary was able to regain Subcarpathian Rus in 1939. All right, so things were kind of nice there, but strong fascist movement. This was not the old Hungarian government coming back, much to people's surprise. What happens? One of the biggest things of World War II is this, what we see now with the anti-Semitic demonstrations that we have on a lot of our campuses in this country, and anti-Israel demonstrations. All right, the Jews, and people say terrible things like gas the Jews and put the Jews back in the ovens and so forth. The destruction of Central European Jewry. 6 million Jews were killed under the Nazis, right? And important to know that the Greek Catholic Church, the Ruthenian Greek Catholic Church and Jews had a very good relationship. There were never pogroms against Jews in Subcarpathian Rus or Slovakia or in northern Hungary. And they did not live in separate communities. They were intermixed in the towns and in the villages. That's really important. When Slovakia began to deport the Jews to Auschwitz to be murdered, Blessed Paul Peter Gojdich is the only bishop in Slovakia. And to be honest, I think, and I've studied this for a long time, I think he's the only bishop in all of occupied Europe. He would go right up to those boxcars with baptismal certificates to get people out. He went right into the train yard in Prešov. And in Slovakia, if you had a baptismal certificate attesting that you had been baptized before 1939, all you needed was one member of a Jewish family to have been baptized. Then the entire family could be saved. That was the law, because it was a Catholic republic. This young lady got baptized, and as a result, she was saved, her parents, her sisters, and all of her grandparents were saved. So Gojdich himself is instrumental in the rescue of over 1,500 Jews in Slovakia. It is a story that is totally unknown and should be well known. 1,000, just him. Her father was out on the street once. She was at the Basilian Sisters School in Prešov. This is a group photo of the girls from the sisters' school. Her father was out on the street, and there was a roundup of Jews, and Gojdich saw him and came out of the palace and hugged him and walked him back into the palace and saved his life. He personally baptized Jews at the Redemptorist Monastery in Michalovce and would kiss them. And the secret police filed reports against him that they were disgusted by his behavior. Father Michael Oshavice, here with Bishop Gojdich, and his parishioners, they saved over 100 Jews in their village. When the Germans occupied Oshavice, Father Masle spoke German, and he went up to them and he said, "Oh, I'll help you." And he said, "I'll tell you which house you can stay in." And he put German soldiers in houses that were not hiding Jews. and saved all of these people. So our church is and one of our priests and his wife, they created a concoction that made ink look like old ink, so that the certificates that people presented to the Germans or to the Slovak Hlinka Guard looked like old baptismal certificates from the 1930s. And they created this, and they used that in Slovakia, and they used that in Subcarpathian Rus to save people's lives. So it's a wonderful chapter that is unfortunately not known. All right, this is the destruction of Poland in 1939. Everybody forgets this. The Russians want to forget this. The Germans attacked Poland from the west. The Russians attacked from the east. The government eventually had to leave Warsaw and move down to Lviv. In Lviv, Lviv today, in Lviv, this was the bridgehead. And they were to hold out here until Britain and France attacked Germany from the west. But the Russians broke their treaty with Poland and invaded, right? And they conquered this. And they never wanted to give it up, and they didn't, except for this little corner around Białystok. Right? This all becomes part of the Soviet Union, and there's this tremendous persecution of Armenian, Greek, and Roman Catholics as a result. So they stay, right, what the Pope had warned about in 1919. And, of course, the import, communism. Blessed Theodore Ramja was 33 years old. In 1944, he finds out, much to his shock, that he is going to be the new bishop of Mukachevo. Bishop Stoica died suddenly. Bishop Stoica helped the Jews when Hungary was occupied by the German army in 1944. Bishop Stoica came to their assistance, but he had a heart attack and died. The Red Army was on its way in. Bishop Dudas in Hungary wrote to Rome and said, you got to name this guy because he studied at the Rusicum, he knew Russian, and he knew Marxist-Leninism, and he would be able to deal with the communists on their own terms. He was the youngest bishop in the world. He's the first bishop martyr of our church. Okay, this is the great Soviet posters that were put up in Ukraine and Subcarpathian Rus. Our army is an army of liberation of the workers. And here's the Soviet soldier being kissed by a happy Ukrainian peasant who is so thrilled that he's being liberated from the Polish lords by the Russian soldier. It's all garbage, of course, but that's how it was. And again, the misfortune of being in a strategic location. Stalin took a pencil. Honest to God, this is how he did this at Yalta. He took a pencil at the Yalta conference with Roosevelt and Churchill, and he drew a line through Poland and then through Czechoslovakia. And then he got all this taken, all right, so he seized this territory, and then he realized the rail line at Chop wasn't inside his pencil, so he got a pencil out again and just drew another line. And all these people ended up inside the Soviet Union. So they were joyfully reunited with their mother church of Moscow, which they had never been under, and joyfully reunited with the Soviet motherland, which they had never been part of. And then the Ush River, that artificial line that had been drawn back in 1919, became the new boundary with Czechoslovakia. There really was a legitimate fear that Stalin was going to claim Slovakia next, and that he would go all the way up to Prague. So, and this, of course, unleashes, the massive persecution of religion in Eastern Europe. And they become part of Ukraine because the Carpathian Mountains go through here, and there are mountain passes that come into here. And the Red Army would come through here in 1956, right, to put down the Hungarian Revolution. And they would come through here again in 1968 to put down the Prague Spring. So, and that's the end of part one. So, there we are. 1,100 years of history. So, all right, was it good? I hope. Did you learn something?
Wonderful.
Yes.
Could I ask just one quick question?
No, you cannot ask questions. You must know everything. Father will now pass out the test. Yes, what's your question?
The
Yes.
I saw it there. Now, how did that fit into the
Fulton Sheen had Byzantine faculties, and so he would come to our pilgrimage, and he would celebrate liturgy as a Byzantine bishop. He was Roman Catholic, but he had Byzantine Rite faculties. And he would go around America with Bishop Elko of our church, and they would celebrate liturgies in different cities to teach Roman Catholics about the Byzantine Rite. It was really very successful because Sheen was so popular. You know, he was so popular in America. It did great work for building up Roman Catholics' awareness of the Byzantine Catholic Church.
another thing that I noticed here?
And he used English. He used English, celebrated the liturgy in English, long before English was used in the Roman Rite. So in the 50s, we were using English. In the 40s, Sheen using English, it really put us on the map. It was very important what Sheen did.
You mentioned also the Sisters of St. Basil.
Yes.
Now, is there an order of community of men that are with the Basil?
We don't have the next time you'll see what happens. Yeah, we don't have an order of men of St. Basil in America now, but we do in Europe. And we still have Sisters of St. Basil.
You still have the sisters? Because it's St. Pius, our daughter went to school.
The priests who used to teach at St. Pius High School were the Congregation of St. Basil, which is different. They're a Roman Catholic order from Spain.
So it's different.
Yeah, they're CSB. Our priests were OSBM, Order of St. Basil the Great.
Because they're usually...
And much older, because they go back to St. Basil himself in the 300s of the first century, or the first centuries of Christianity.
When you mentioned about, what was it, became Orthodox 1054 and 1240, one of our relatives married into a Russian. She came from Estonia, and she's Russian Orthodox.
Yes, there's a lot of Russian Orthodox in Estonia.
They were assured by they would not let the Catholic two priests that represented the groom to be able, they could not officiate behind, it was only the...
Right. You cannot have Catholic and Orthodox celebrate a liturgy. We can pray together, but they can't offer liturgy or sacraments together.
But isn't that the fact that if you're in one of those churches for a Sunday Mass that you receive...
You can receive Holy Communion in an Orthodox church according to Catholic canon law if you're in a situation where there's no Catholic church available to you. For example, if you were in, Eastern Russia and Siberia for some reason, and there was no Catholic parish available. But the Orthodox really don't want Catholics receiving Holy Communion in their church.
But it can happen without you.
It can happen, but the Orthodox don't like it. Yeah.
As I say, they didn't want the two priests that were representing the groom. They vested and they said in the first...
Right. Yeah, the priests, you can't, it's called communicatio in sacris, and we can't have that between Catholic and Orthodox, because we are two totally separate churches. Okay? Okay, sure. Anybody else? All right, Father Artur, you want to give out the test? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes? Was there a question? No? Okay. Is that it? Okay. Thank you very much for coming tonight. Thanks a lot.